Imagine this. A killer lives directly across the street from the girl he is about to murder. His name is already written in the police report the morning her body is discovered. Detectives knock on his door. They speak to him face to face. They look him in the eye. And then they walk away. They close their notebooks, cross his name off the list, and move on. And that killer goes back inside his house, closes his own door, and lives a completely normal life for the next 23 years. He raises his kids. He runs his errands. He sleeps through the night without a single consequence. Meanwhile, the wrong man goes to prison. A mother loses her mind with grief and fury. And the real answer sits right there, right across the street, hiding in plain sight the entire time. This is not a story about a monster who was impossible to find. This is a story about a monster who was never truly looked for even when he was standing right in front of them. Welcome to Midnight Crime. Tonight, we are going somewhere that is going to shake you. Stay with us. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Every single week, Midnight Crime brings you the cases that prove truth is always stranger, darker, and more devastating than anything fiction could ever dream up. Like this video, drop a comment telling us you are watching, and let us get into this story because every single second of it matters. We need to start where it all began. In a town that trusted itself completely. Idaho Falls, Idaho. Population 65,000 people. The city rests right on the Snake River, and it carries itself with the quiet, earned pride of a place that knows exactly what it is. A nearly quarter-mile waterfall runs through the heart of downtown. The Idaho Falls Temple rises above the water-white walls, clean lines, the spiritual center of a community that was deeply, genuinely close-knit. People here knew their neighbors by name. They waved from their driveways. They left their front doors unlocked at night without giving it a second thought. That kind of trust takes generations to build. It only takes one night to destroy it. Angie Dodge grew up in motion. Her father served in the Navy, which meant the family never stayed in one place long enough to call it home. State to state. School to school. New kids, new classrooms, new streets. And just when a place started to feel like something real, the boxes came back out. She had 3 older brothers, and they had each other. Angie had herself. But that childhood, all that constant uprooting, all that relentless starting over built something in her. Something tough, and adaptable, and warm in a way that was genuinely rare. She learned to walk into a room full of strangers and make people feel like they had known her for years. She had no choice in the matter. Life had been training her for exactly that her whole life. When her father finally retired and the family settled in Idaho Falls, Angie did what she had always done. She found her people. Along the banks of the Snake River, a loose group of local teenagers had carved out their own little world. Different schools, different ages, all connected by the same stretch of water, the same late nights, the same shared feeling that this river, this place, was theirs and theirs alone. They called themselves the River Rats. They would drive the winding river road until the gas ran out, swim when it was hot enough to make the water feel like relief, and sit on the banks until midnight talking about nothing and everything at the same time. Angie fit right in from the very first night. She was loud. She was funny. She had something to say, and she said it no filter, no apology, no hesitation. Her mother Carol described her in the simplest and most perfect way she could find. She said Angie had something to say, and she said it. She was also, by every single account, beautiful. Thick blonde hair cut into a sharp bob just below her ears. A smile that did not quietly sit on her face, it took over everything. Her eyes, her presence, the entire energy of whatever room she walked into. She wore statement earrings that caught the light beneath that short hair, and she carried herself with a loud, joyful confidence that people remembered long after she had left. But inside, she was fighting a quiet war with herself. Angie was nearly 6 feet tall, and she hated it. She thought her shoulders were too broad. Her feet too big. She was so self-conscious about the size of her feet that she bought her shoes 2 sizes too small and wore them every single day. She walked around in real, constant pain because she was more afraid of being judged than she was of hurting. 18 years old, already carrying the weight the world hands young women without ever asking permission. She was brilliant, too. She tutored other kids in mathematics and English. She had graduated high school by 1995 and was setting her sights on Idaho State University. She had a job at Barnes & Noble, and she had been saving her paychecks for months because she had her eye on something. A new car. Her old one was falling apart, but she was not going to ask anyone for help. Paycheck by paycheck, she saved. And sometime in the spring of 1996, she walked off that lot with the keys in her hand and a feeling in her chest that only comes from buying something entirely on your own. She was proud of that car the way you can only be proud of something you truly earned. 3 weeks before she died, Angie moved out of her family home. She and her mother had a fight. The details do not matter very much anymore. But the feeling between them afterward does, that heavy, unspoken distance that settles between two people who love each other deeply and just do not know how to say it right now. Angie found herself a ground-floor apartment on I Street. An older neighborhood, a little rough around the edges, but close to her parents, close to the river, close to everything that mattered to her. It was hers. 4 walls that belonged to her for the first time in her life. For a girl who had spent her entire childhood never quite landing anywhere, that apartment must have felt like finally exhaling for the very first time. She had been living there for 3 weeks. She was just beginning. The night of June the 12th, 1996, Angie drove to her parents' house for dinner. It was her first visit since the fight. There was that quiet, careful tension that fills a room when 2 people are slowly circling back toward each other but neither one quite wants to be the first to move. Carol took that step. She told her daughter she was glad she wasn't still angry. And Angie, this girl who had wrestled with her brothers her whole childhood, who had never stayed down for long, who had fought her way into every new town she ever landed in, looked at her mother and said 4 words. Not even in a blue moon. And then she laid her head on Carol's shoulder, and they stood there together in the kitchen, rocking slowly back and forth. Carol held on to her daughter and felt something she could not name, something she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe. She did not know it then. She could not have known it. But those 4 words were the last ones Angie Dodge would ever say to her mother. Later that night, Angie drove home in her brand new car, the one she saved for, the one she earned. She moved through the quiet streets of Idaho Falls. Past the temple. Past the river. Past the neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone and the doors stayed unlocked and the night felt completely safe. She pulled up to her apartment on I Street. She walked inside. She closed the door. Somewhere on that same street, close enough to see her light come on through the window, someone stood in the dark and watched. He had seen her before. He knew which apartment was hers. He knew she lived alone. And he knew that the door she had just walked through, the same door she trusted to keep the world out, was not going to stop him. He had already decided. It started with a missed shift. Just that. A girl who did not show up for work. Her boss called. The phone rang. Nobody answered. He figured she had overslept. These things happen. But when her coworkers tried and got the same silence, something shifted. Not panic. Not yet. Just that small, quiet feeling that something is slightly off. The kind of feeling you try to talk yourself out of. They drove to I Street anyway. They knocked on the apartment door. Nothing. No footsteps. No television. No sound of a life being lived on the other side. Just a stillness that pressed against the door like something solid. The kind of silence that does not belong to a sleeping person. The kind that belongs to an empty house. Except the house was not supposed to be empty. One of them reached out and tried the handle. It opened. They moved through the apartment calling her name. Room to room. Hallway to hallway. The silence getting heavier with every step. That wrong feeling growing louder in their chests, even though nothing yet looked visibly out of place. Then they reached the bedroom door. They pushed it open. What they found on the other side is the kind of thing that rewires a person permanently. You do not recover from it. You do not file it away. It just lives inside you from that moment forward, every single day, for the rest of your life. The scene was devastating. Her clothes had been torn. The nature of the attack was catastrophically violent, suggesting a level of rage that was deeply, terrifyingly personal. This was someone who had kept going long after there was any reason to. And right beside her, close enough to touch, sat a laundry basket full of stuffed animals. On one side, a child's innocence. On the other, the brutality of what had been done to her. Two worlds that had no business being in the same room, forced together in the most devastating way imaginable. She was 18 years old. 3 weeks into her first apartment. Brand new car parked outside. The officer who processed that crime scene had been on the job for exactly 2 months. He had been warned before he went in. His colleagues told him it was graphic. Told him to prepare himself. He picked up his camera, climbed the stairs, and started photographing his approach exactly the way he had been trained to do. And then he stepped through that bedroom doorway. His hands were steady because they had to be. His job required it. But behind the lens, something in him was recording more than just evidence. He was recording a nightmare. Decades later, he confirmed it. Said it was probably the worst thing he had ever seen in his entire career. That is how bad it was. The forensic team went to work, and here is where 1996 handed police something they had almost never had before, something that felt, in that moment, like a guaranteed answer. The killer had left his DNA at the scene. Not traces. Not fragments. Clear, complete, undeniable biological evidence. Semen. Skin cells under Angie's fingernails. She had fought back hard, exactly the way you would expect from a girl who had spent her whole childhood refusing to stay down. A hair that did not belong to her. He had left all of it behind. No attempt to clean up. No attempt to hide what he had done. The lead investigator called it exactly what it was. The killer had left his calling card. In 1996, DNA profiling still felt close to magic. The science was new enough that juries were stunned by it. Detectives treated that evidence like a guaranteed key. They had his complete biological identity. All they needed to do was find the person it belonged to and run the match. They were confident. They had no idea what was coming. Carol Dodge got the call that morning. Her son Brent was the one who told her. He looked at his mother and said the words. "She is gone, Mom. She is gone." He carried those words for years afterward. Said they haunted him in a way nothing else ever did. For Carol, that phone call drew a line straight through the middle of her life. Everything before it. Everything after it. The woman she had been on the other side of that line was gone, taken with the same swiftness as her daughter. She never slept the same way again. Police moved through Angie's world like a net. Friends, family, neighbors, ex-boyfriends, co-workers, anyone who had ever shared a conversation with her. From nearly every one of those interviews, they collected a DNA sample and held their breath. Over 100 samples. Tested. Compared against that pristine profile from the crime scene. 100 people. 100 negatives. The circle got tighter. The results stayed exactly the same. Every time they closed in on someone, the science cleared them. The killer's DNA sat in that lab complete, unambiguous, practically introducing itself and matched no one. Not a single person connected to Angie's world. The confidence that had filled that investigation in the early weeks slowly curdled into something else. The town that had trusted its quiet streets and its unlocked doors began looking at its neighbors differently. Parents who had never thought twice about their children walking home alone were suddenly thinking about nothing else. 6 months passed. Christmas came. It would have been Angie's 19th birthday. The case had gone cold. Carol Dodge stood outside the police station so often that the officers gave the back entrance a nickname. They called it the Carol Door. She printed thousands of flyers by hand. Offered $5,000 of her own money as a reward for any information leading to an arrest. She called the investigators underqualified to their faces. The DNA was still sitting in that lab. Still waiting. Still matching no one. Then January arrived, and a phone call came in from Nevada. A man named Benjamin Hobbs had been arrested in Elko 400 miles from Idaho Falls. The charge was a violent attack involving a woman and a knife. Police felt something snap to attention, because Benjamin Hobbs was not a stranger. He was a river rat. He had known Angie. They drove to Nevada to question him. What happened next in those interrogation rooms, first with Hobbs, then with a 20-year-old kid whose name Hobbs mentioned almost in passing, would send an innocent man to prison for 2 decades. His name was Christopher Tapp. He was 20 years old. He had known Angie the way you know someone from a shared group of friends, casually, warmly, without any reason for it to ever become anything darker than that. He had absolutely no idea that his name had just entered a police file. And he had no idea at all what was about to happen to him. In January of 1997, police came knocking. The first interview, Chris cooperated fully. Answered every question. Talked about the river rats, about Hobbs, about the night of the murder. Told them clearly he was not involved. He had been on a date. He knew nothing. Police thanked him. And called him back. The second interview felt different. The tone had shifted. Questions became implications. Detectives suggested he knew more than he was saying, that maybe he was not being fully honest, that maybe his loyalty to Benjamin was getting in the way. Chris, trying to be helpful, said he could not fully vouch for what Benjamin had been doing that night. To police, that looked like a crack in the wall. They called him back a third time. Chris did not show, not because he was running. He was scared. His family was scared. His mother told police he would come involuntarily in 2 days, with a lawyer present. Police showed up at his house and arrested him that same day. His lawyer met him at the station. But instead of sitting beside his client in that interrogation room, the lawyer was placed in an adjacent room with a television screen. He could watch. He could technically interject. But there was a wall between them. A door. A hallway. A buffer that made all the difference in the world. A young man was inside that room, cornered and terrified. And the person whose entire job was to protect him was sitting in the next room watching it happen on a screen. That single detail tells you everything you need to know about what came next. 100 hours. 9 sessions. Multiple polygraph exams. 100 hours is more than 4 full days, spread across multiple sessions. And each time Chris walked back into that room, he walked in a little more worn down than before. A little less certain of his own memory. A little more convinced that the walls were closing in regardless of what he said. His eyes were red. His hands trembled. He was running on broken sleep and raw fear, and every session picked up exactly where the last one had left the damage. Then they strapped him to the polygraph machine. Here is what most people do not know about polygraphs. They are not science. They measure breathing rate, pulse, and skin conductivity, basic stress responses that any human being produces when they are frightened, exhausted, or sitting in a room where someone is telling them they might spend the rest of their life in prison. The machine cannot detect lies. It detects anxiety. And Chris Tapp in that room had more than enough anxiety to send every needle into the red. But detectives looked at those readings and told him something that would alter the entire course of his life. They said the machine never lies. His story changed 6 times. First came total denial. I was not there. I know nothing. I do not understand what you want from me. Then the first crack, under mounting pressure. Maybe Ben was involved. I cannot be completely sure what he was doing. Then the collapse of certainty. Maybe I was there. I just do not remember clearly. Then a full scenario emerged, shaped almost entirely by what detectives had fed him session by session. Ben did it. I was there. I tried to stop it. Then came the betrayal. A detective who had worked at Chris's own high school leaned in close during one session, dropped his voice, and told him something that was completely false. He said that if Chris had been acting out of fear for his own life, his sentence could be reduced. The man who was supposed to protect him was watching a screen in the next room. The man who reminded him of school was digging the grave deeper with every word. Chris grabbed the lifeline. Not because it was true. Because he was 20 years old and terrified, and he had been in that room for so long that survival had replaced truth entirely. He confessed to holding Angie down. He named a third person, an 18-year-old named Jeremy Sargus. Jeremy was arrested, DNA tested, and cleared immediately. Benjamin Hobbs was cleared in Angie's case. Chris Tapp was the only one left standing. His trial began in 1998. He was 22 years old. The jury saw the confession footage. Not the early sessions. Not the hours of him screaming that he had nothing to do with it. Not the moments where he could not even identify which room the murder had taken place in, and detectives had to correct him. Just the end. Just the broken version of a young man agreeing to a story that had been constructed around him piece by piece over 100 hours. After 13 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back. Guilty. 30 years to life. Carol Dodge stood in that courtroom and called him a beast. She meant every word. She needed someone to be accountable for what had been done to her daughter. And the justice system had just handed her a name. But something sat in her chest that she could not shake. Because Chris Tapp's DNA had never matched the sample from Angie's apartment. Not even close. The man now serving 30 years to life for the assault and murder of Angie Dodge had left no biological trace anywhere at that crime scene. Carol had gotten her conviction. But Angie's killer, the real one, the one whose DNA was still sitting in that lab, had just watched an innocent man take the fall. And somewhere in Idaho Falls, he went home, made dinner, went to sleep, and lived his life like nothing had happened at all. If you are still watching at this point, drop the word "still" here in the comments right now. Let us see who is truly following this story, because it is about to go somewhere you will not believe. Carol Dodge did not stop. Not for a single day. She printed thousands of flyers and distributed them through neighborhoods herself. She offered $5,000 of her own money as a reward. She accused the investigators of being underqualified street cops promoted beyond their abilities, and she said it directly to their faces. When the police did not move fast enough, Carol moved herself. She drove around Idaho Falls late at night, alone, tailing people she suspected. She tracked down local drug dealers, knocked on the wrong doors, asked questions in the wrong neighborhoods. At least once, someone pulled a gun on her. She kept going anyway. This was not the behavior of someone who had accepted the verdict and moved on. This was a mother who had looked at 23 years of unanswered questions and decided that if no one else was going to find the truth, she would find it herself, whatever it cost her. For years, she got nowhere. Chris Tapp sat in prison. The real DNA sat unmatched in a lab. The case technically had its conviction, which meant there was very little institutional motivation to keep digging. Carol kept showing up at the Carol door. Kept being told there was nothing new. Kept leaving and coming back the next day anyway. Then Christmas of 2009 arrived. Someone gave Carol Dodge a computer. It sounds small. It was not. Carol, who had been fighting this battle mostly through phone calls, flyers, and showing up in person, suddenly had access to something she had never had before. The Internet. And on the Internet, she found something that changed everything. The Idaho Innocence Project, founded by a biologist named Greg Hampikian at Boise State University, existed to do one specific thing: free people who had been wrongfully convicted. Using science that had not been available at the time of their trial. In nearly 40 years of combined work, organizations like it had helped exonerate close to 400 people whose convictions had been built on evidence that DNA testing later destroyed entirely. Carol reached out. Hampikian would later say that in all his years running the project, he had never once been contacted by the family of a murder victim asking him to help free the man convicted of killing their loved one. It was the first time in his career. That fact alone tells you something profound about Carol Dodge. As part of her work with the Innocence Project, Carol got access to something that shook her to her core. The interrogation tapes. Old VHS recordings of Chris Tapp's 9 sessions with police. Grainy footage. Barely audible audio. Carol sat through hours of it and watched a young man get systematically dismantled. She watched Chris tell detectives he did not know which house Angie lived in and police had to correct him. She watched him place the murder in Angie's living room. Wrong. It happened in the bedroom and police had to correct him again. Details that only the actual killer would have known instinctively. Details that Chris clearly did not know at all. She had once stood in a courtroom and called this man a beast. Now she picked up the phone and called his defense attorney. Together with Carol, Hampikian, and Chris's new attorney John Thomas, they pushed for new DNA testing. New appeals. New methods. A judge turned down their first request in 2012, writing that while DNA testing might identify one of the assailants, it did not necessarily prove Tapp was innocent. Limited testing was done on Angie's clothing and a teddy bear found at the scene. Tapp was excluded. Hobbs was excluded. The unknown DNA remained unknown. But the technology was changing. And Carol refused to stop pushing. In 2014, investigators tried something that had never been done in quite this way before. They took the killer's DNA profile and ran it against a public genealogy database, one originally built by the Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation, later purchased by Ancestry.com. The idea was simple. If they could not find the killer directly, maybe they could find a relative. And they got a hit. 34 out of 35 DNA markers matched a man named Michael Usry Sr., who had donated his DNA years earlier for a religious genealogy project with absolutely no idea it would ever be used this way. Investigators focused on his son, Michael Usry Jr., a filmmaker living in New Orleans whose films explored dark themes, who had passed through Idaho Falls years earlier. For 33 days, Michael Usry Jr. lived under the shadow of a murder investigation. His reputation shifted. His name circulated. He stood on his sidewalk after being questioned and had no idea what was happening to his life. Then the DNA results came back. No match. Not even close. Usry was cleared. Ancestry.com quietly made their database private. And the investigation was back to zero. The real killer had never been touched. Had never been looked at twice. Was living a completely normal life, and had been living it without a single interruption since the night he walked back across the street from Angie's apartment in 1996. So where do you look when every road has run out? You find someone willing to go further than anyone has gone before. By late 2018, the Angie Dodge case had been cold for over 2 decades. Chris Tapp was out of prison, but still legally considered a murderer. The real killer's DNA sat in a lab, pristine, complete, and still matching no one. Every traditional method had been tried and exhausted. Every database had returned empty. Every lead had dissolved into nothing. Carol Dodge had one move left. She picked up the phone and called a woman named Cece Moore. Cece Moore called herself the genetic detective, and that title was not an exaggeration. She worked out of Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a private laboratory that had been quietly doing something that most of the law enforcement world was still struggling to understand. She had spent years using DNA not just as identification, but as a map. A map that could lead you backward through time, through grandparents and great-grandparents and ancestors born 2 centuries ago, and then forward again, branch by branch, generation by generation, until you arrived at a single living person standing somewhere in the present. By the time Carol reached her, Moore had already used this method to help solve dozens of cold cases. She understood exactly how powerful the technology was. She also understood exactly how difficult this particular case was going to be. The DNA sample from Angie's crime scene had been sitting in evidence storage for over 20 years. Time is not kind to biological material. When Moore's team assessed the sample, they found it was only 61% intact. Most labs would have stopped there. Most analysts would have closed the file and called it too compromised to produce reliable results. Moore made adjustments, rebuilt what she could, and decided to try anyway. Here is how genetic genealogy works in the simplest possible terms. Millions of ordinary people have uploaded their DNA to public databases like GEDmatch. They did it to find cousins, trace their heritage, satisfy curiosity about where their families came from. They were not thinking about crime scenes or cold cases or detectives. They were just building family trees. But every one of those uploaded profiles is invisibly, mathematically connected to every biological relative who has ever done the same thing. And when Moore uploaded the unknown DNA from Angie's crime scene, the database began returning matches. Not exact matches. Partial ones. People who shared significant chunks of DNA with the unknown suspect because they shared ancestors with him. Cousins. Second cousins. Relatives who had never met him and had no idea he existed. Moore called these clusters genetic networks, and she began building 3 of them, each representing a different branch of the unknown suspect's family tree. For matches shared between 85 and 95 centimorgans of DNA with the killer. That range suggests relationships like second cousins or half-first cousins, close enough to be meaningful, far enough away to require serious genealogical work to narrow down. Moore built those 3 networks simultaneously, tracing each one backward through generations. And then she looked for the point where all 3 converged. Every single road led to the same place. A couple named Clarence Urey and Cleo Latham. Clarence was born in 1896. Cleo in 1899. They had built a family across decades, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren spreading out across America like branches from a single trunk. Somewhere among those descendants was the man who had walked into Angie Dodge's apartment on the night of June 13, 1996. Moore and her team mapped every known male descendant of that couple who would have been the right age in 1996. They eliminated those who had died before the murder. Those who were still children at the time. Those who had never lived anywhere near Idaho. They were left with 6 names. 6 possible suspects. 6 men whose DNA, if tested, might finally close this case. Police began working through the list quietly and carefully. They identified the one man among the 6 who had actually been living in Idaho in 1996 at the time of Angie's murder. They surveilled him. Waited for him to discard something, a cup, a cigarette, anything that carried his DNA without his knowledge. Eventually they collected a sample and sent it to the lab. The result came back negative. Not a match. The investigation absorbed that blow and kept moving. More went back to her networks. Back to the family tree. Back to the branches she had already mapped a dozen times, looking for something she had missed. 3 months later, she found it. An obituary. A woman named Helen Darnell had passed away, and buried inside that obituary's family history was a detail that changed everything. Helen had a daughter who had once been married to a man from the Urey family line. That marriage had ended in divorce. After the divorce, a son had been born under a completely different last name. His father's DNA ran through the Urey bloodline, carrying the same connection back to Clarence and Cleo. But he had been raised by his stepfather. He had grown up carrying his stepfather's surname. He had never appeared in any search tied to the Urey family name. He was invisible to every search that had come before. His name was Brian Drips. Detectives pulled the old records from 1996. Rental agreements. Neighborhood canvases. Original case files. And there it was. Brian Lee Drips Sr. 31 years old in June of 1996. Living directly across the street from Angie Dodge's apartment on I Street. His name was in the original police report. He had been briefly questioned during the neighborhood canvass 5 days after the murder. One knock among dozens. One name among hundreds. He had denied knowing anything. Police had moved on. He had been sitting in the first 25 pages of an investigation that had been running for 23 years. Carol Dodge, when she heard his name and his address, said 4 words. "You have got to be kidding." Now they knew who he was. They knew where he lived. They knew what he had done. But they could not just knock on his door. They could not tip him off. They had one shot at this, and it had to be done in complete silence. A quiet town about 300 miles from Idaho Falls. Modest streets. Ordinary houses. Brian Drips was living here with his mother. He was 53 years old, white beard, hands roughened by decades of construction work. From the outside, just another working-class man living out his middle years in a small Idaho town. He had no idea that a team of detectives had just parked down the street from his mother's house. He had no idea that 23 years of silence were about to run out. The detectives could not walk up to the door. Could not knock. Could not reveal themselves in any way. Because if Brian Drips was their man and everything C.C. Moore's analysis said that he was, then tipping him off meant giving him time to run. Time to disappear. Time to become the kind of problem that takes another decade to solve. They needed something he had discarded. Something that carried his DNA without him ever knowing it had been taken. So they watched. And they waited. Day 1 stretched across 14 hours. 14 hours sitting in an unmarked car watching a house, watching a driveway, watching a man go about his completely ordinary day with the easy comfort of someone who had never once been touched by the consequences of what he had done. Not a single usable sample. 14 hours. Nothing. The team regrouped and shifted strategy. If they could not get DNA from Brian directly, maybe they could get close enough through his son. The son was too young to have been involved in Angie's murder, but he shared his father's DNA. A sample from the son would not give them a conviction, but it would tell them whether they were in the right family. They followed the son. Eventually, at a petrol station, the son climbed out of his car and spat a lump of chewing tobacco onto the ground. Detectives moved in the moment he drove away. They collected it, bagged it, and sent it to the lab. Negative. For a moment, the investigation sat in a very uncomfortable place. What if there was yet another unknown branch of this family tree? What if Brian Drips was a dead end and the real killer was someone Moore had not yet found, another hidden descendant, another child born under another name, buried in another obituary in another small town somewhere? The fear was real and pressing. They had been here before. 6 suspects tested and cleared. The possibility that this was another wrong turn was not abstract. It was a genuine threat to everything they had built. But more had done the work. The networks were solid. The convergence was precise. Everything pointed here to this man, in this town, outside this house. They went back to Caldwell. The next morning, Brian Dripps left his mother's house with a cigarette already burning between his fingers. Detectives watched him get into his car. Watched the cigarette move to the window as he pulled out of the driveway. This was apparently routine, a morning smoke on the drive out. They followed at a distance. When the cigarette was finished, his hand moved to the window and dropped it onto the road. Detectives pulled over immediately. Climbed out. Moved toward the spot where it had landed. And stopped. The street was covered in cigarette butts. Dozens of them. Old. Weathered. Indistinguishable from each other. There was absolutely no way to know with certainty which one Brian had just thrown. They could not risk submitting the wrong sample. Could not afford another negative that sent them back to square one. They let it go. And came back the next morning. Same routine. Same driveway. Same cigarette appearing in the window as he pulled out of the driveway into the morning air. Detectives followed again. Watching the cigarette burn down. Watching his hand. Watching the precise moment his fingers released it through the open window. This time, the butt hit the road still lit. Still smoking. A thin curl of smoke rising from a single point on the pavement, marking it as clearly as a flare in the dark. Detectives were out of the car before it stopped rolling. They moved to that precise spot, collected that single still smoldering cigarette butt, sealed it into an evidence bag, and drove straight to the Idaho State Police lab. Then they waited. The result came back. Full match. The DNA from the saliva on that cigarette matched the DNA recovered from Angie Dodge's apartment on June 13, 1996. 23 years. Dozens of failed leads. 100 interrogation hours spent breaking an innocent man. 33 days of terror for a filmmaker who had nothing to do with any of it. A mother who had fought every single day for over 2 decades. And in the end, it came down to one cigarette, still burning on a street in Caldwell, Idaho. On May 15, 2019, detectives found Brian Dripps at a bank. He was just finishing an ordinary errand on an ordinary afternoon. He had spent 23 years doing ordinary things, running errands, raising his kids, going to sleep at night in a world where no one was looking at him. 3 officers approached him. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that a woman in Virginia had rebuilt a broken strand of DNA and followed it through 2 centuries of family history straight to his front door. No idea that a mother in Idaho Falls had refused to stop not for one single day for 23 years. He just saw 3 officers walking toward him outside a bank. They brought him in. For 5 hours, Brian Dripps sat in that interrogation room and denied everything. Denied knowing Angie. Denied being near her apartment. Denied all of it calmly and consistently, for 5 full hours. And then he asked if he could step outside for a smoke break. They let him go. He came back inside, sat down, and went very, very quiet. Not the quiet of someone choosing his words carefully. Not the silence of a man still deciding what to say. This was something else entirely. The quiet of a person who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has finally run out of the strength to keep holding it up. Brian Dripps looked at the detectives across the table and told them what he had done. He said he had been drunk that night. High on cocaine. His wife had just left him, taken the kids, walked out the door, left him alone in an apartment directly across the street from a girl he had been watching. He said he went over there with a pocket knife. He said he went over there with a plan. Not a random crime. Not a moment of sudden, uncontrolled rage. He had looked across that street at Angie Dodge's window at the light coming through it, and he had made a decision. He crossed the street. He went through her unlocked door while she was asleep. And then he did what he had planned to do. He said he remembered the assault. Remembered that part clearly. "I guess it just happened when I was there," he told them. "I remember the rape part. That is all I remember of that evening." He had a pocket knife. He went there on purpose. He left a girl dead on her bedroom floor next to her childhood stuffed animals. And his explanation, after 23 years of silence, was that it just happened. He also confirmed something that mattered enormously for another reason entirely. He said he acted alone. He did not know Christopher Tapp. Had never met him. Had nothing to do with him. The man who had spent 20 years in prison for this crime was not in that apartment that night. Had never been in that apartment. The confession that destroyed Chris Tapp's life had been built from nothing, fabricated under 100 hours of psychological pressure in a police interrogation room. And the real killer had just confirmed it with 3 words. He acted alone. The next morning, May the 16th, 2019, Idaho Falls Police Chief Bryce Johnson stood in front of cameras and microphones and told the world that Brian Lee Dripps Sr. had been arrested for the rape and murder of Angie Dodge. Carol Dodge heard his name spoken out loud for the first time. She said later that she gasped. That just hearing his name, the actual name of the actual man, did something to her that she could not fully explain. "I don't know," she said. "I guess I got my air supply back. 23 years. And in one moment, one name, one press conference, she could breathe again." Chris Tapp was at the police station when the announcement was made. He was 38 years old. He had walked into a police interrogation room at 20 years old and never really walked back out. Not fully. Not as the same person. He had lost his 20s. Lost his 30s. Lost the years when most people are building something, a career, a family, a version of themselves they actually chose. And he stood in that station and heard that the man who had actually committed the crime had confessed. Had confirmed that Chris was never there. Had stated clearly that he acted alone. 2 months later, on July the 17th, 2019, Chris Tapp stood before Judge Alan Stevens. The judge looked at him and spoke the words Chris had been waiting 22 years to hear. "As far as this court is concerned, you are cleared of the charges you have been living under for the past 20+ years." Chris spoke afterward. His voice was steady in a way that must have cost him something. "I am so thankful I have been given this second chance at life," he said. "I have wasted 20 years of my life for something I never did. But I also grew up over those 20 years. And then he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. The system thought that I could be thrown away. They thought I would never amount to anything. They were wrong." Carol Dodge and Chris Tapp walked out of that courthouse together. The woman who had once stood in a courtroom and called him a beast. The man who had once sat in a prison cell while she fought to keep him there. They walked out side by side and they raised their fists not in anger, but in something harder to name. Something that only 2 people who have been through exactly what they went through could possibly feel at the same moment. It was not a happy ending. It was not closure. It was just, finally, the truth. Brian Dripps got his day in court on February the 9th, 2021. He sat before a judge in Bonneville County and pleaded guilty. He said again that he had not meant to kill her. That he was sorry. That he wished he could do that night over. But before the judge spoke, the family of Angie Dodge got to speak first. Carol looked her daughter's killer directly in the eyes. Her brothers stood beside her. And what that family said in that courtroom on that day after 25 years of waiting is the kind of thing that stays with a person forever. Angie Dodge was 18 years old. She had a brand new car she saved for herself. She had a brand new apartment she was just beginning to make her own. She had a mother who loved her fiercely and a whole life stretched out ahead of her. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to grow old. She deserved every single year that was stolen from her on the night of June the 13th, 1996. And she deserved, at the very least, to be remembered. Not just as a victim, but as the girl who tutored kids in math and English. The girl who walked around in shoes 2 sizes too small because she cared so deeply about how the world saw her. The girl who bought her first car with her own money and felt that specific, irreplaceable pride. The river rat who could walk into any room and make strangers feel like family. The daughter who laid her head on her mother's shoulder and rocked back and forth in a kitchen and said, "Not even in a blue moon." That is who she was. That is who she will always be. If this story moved you, and we believe it did, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Midnight Crime so you never miss a case like this one. Drop a comment below telling us the one moment in this story that hit you the hardest. Was it the cigarette? Was it Carol showing up at that door every single day for 23 years? Was it Chris Tapp walking out of that courthouse? Whatever it was, we want to hear from you. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber tells us to keep going, to keep researching, keep telling these stories, keep making sure the people in them are never forgotten. Angie Dodge deserved better. Chris Tapp deserved better. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way home. This is Midnight Crime. We will see you on the next one.